The rain started on a Tuesday morning in August of 1988 and did not stop for 4 days. By the time it was over, Cullen Creek had jumped its banks in 3 places. The water moved through the lower fields of Aldermore Valley, Somerset, at a pace nobody could outrun and a depth nobody could work in. 62 acres of barley were gone. An old milking shed that had stood since 1947 came off its footings and shifted 4 feet to the east. A hay store belonging to the parish family, 200 bales stacked from March, absorbed so much water that the whole structure buckled inward. On a Friday afternoon, while Knoll Parish stood 20 yards away and watched, 3 farms in Aldermore Valley lost their summer yields entirely that August. One did not. The one that kept its crops was a 48-acre holding on the western edge of the valley, owned by a retired schoolmaster named Gerald Fenn. Gerald was 61 years old, had farmed this particular piece of land since 1969 when he purchased it for £3.400 from a widow in Taunton who no longer had use for it. The soil was clay-heavy, moderately productive, and slightly elevated on its northern boundary. He had been told, when he bought it, that the elevation was a minor advantage. He had spent 19 years turning it into a major one. The neighbors knew what Gerald had done along his northern hedgerow. They had watched him do it, across 2 planting seasons in 1979 and 1980. They had talked about it at the Aldermore market. They had said, without particular cruelty but with full certainty, that he was wasting his labor. A retired schoolmaster who fancied himself an improver, building hedgerows like a man who had never farmed a real season. The hedgerow he was reinforcing was already 14 feet wide. He was adding a second layer of hawthorn, filled maple, and blackthorn on the outer face, packing the base with dead wood and bramble, driving stakes every 8 feet to anchor it during establishment. The men who watched him said it would catch wind and nothing else. Gerald kept planting. He had started with a question, not a theory, not a plan, just a question that had bothered him for 3 years. The lower northwest corner of his holding flooded in wet years. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but enough to lose weeks of growing time, enough to compact the clay subsoil into something close to cement when the water finally drained. He had tried French drains in 1974. They silted within 2 growing seasons and cost him £180 to install. He had graded the surface of that corner with a borrowed Massey Ferguson 135-in-1, 976 attempting to redirect surface flow. It helped marginally. The compaction problem continued. He walked that corner a lot in the winters of 1977 and 1978, stood there in cold mornings with his boots sinking an inch into waterlogged clay, looked at the hedgerow on the northern boundary, thought about what it was actually doing. The existing hedge was 6 feet wide and 8 feet tall, mature blackthorn, well established. It had been there when he bought the farm. It intercepted some surface runoff from the sloping grazing land to the north. Not all of it, enough to matter in dry years, not enough to matter in wet ones. When a genuine rain event came through, the flow overwhelmed the hedge base, moved beneath it through gaps that had developed over decades, and found the path of least resistance directly into his northwest corner. Gerald started reading, not farming journals, older material, county agricultural records going back to the 1890s, estate management documents from pre-war holdings. He found in a Somerset record office filing from 1903 a notation in a farm manager's journal about a technique used on hill properties in mid-Wales. The notation was 3 sentences long. It described double stacking a hedgerow base with brashwood, dense planting to the outer face, and a shallow berm constructed along the uphill side. The farm manager wrote that the method had been in use on those Welsh properties for at least 40 years before his writing, which put its origin somewhere before 1860. Gerald copied those 3 sentences into a notebook. He sat with them for 2 winters. In the spring of 1979, he started planting. He bought hawthorn whips from a nursery in Bridgewater, 400 of them at 4 pence each. Total cost £16. He bought field maple and blackthorn in similar quantities. He ordered coppice stakes from a woodland supplier in Shepton Mallet, ash, split and sharpened 6 feet long. He sourced dead wood from a neighboring property where a line of elms had been taken down after the disease came through in 1976. Loaded it into his Ford Transit 7 times over a fortnight, stacked it at the field boundary in piles of varying diameter. The work took most of April and all of May that year. He planted the outer hedge face 12 inches from the original hedgerow line. Dense spacing, every 14 inches, alternating hawthorn and blackthorn with field maple every 3rd position. He packed the gap between old and new planting with the dead elm wood, laid horizontally in courses, heaviest material at the base. The stakes went in at an angle along the outer face, driven to a depth of 18 inches, heads leaning inward. He built the berm with a spade and a wheelbarrow, moving clay subsoil from a trench 3 feet out from the hedgerow base. The berm ran for 140 yards along the full northern boundary. It was 8 inches high at the center of the run. Not dramatic, just a low, continuous mound of compacted clay faced with turf. His neighbor Raymond Gale watched this for 3 days in late April. Raymond farmed 60 acres directly to Gerald's east. He had been farming Aldermore since 1965. He said nothing to Gerald directly. He mentioned it at the Shepton Mallet livestock market in May. Said a man who spent 2 weeks building up a hedge had too much time and not enough sense. Said the elm wood would rot out in 4 years, and the whole thing would fall apart from the inside. Gerald heard this from a man named David Pritchard, who traded sheep with Raymond and thought Gerald ought to know. Gerald thanked him, kept planting. The establishment period was slow. The whips were 18 inches tall when planted and grew no faster than 8 inches per year in clay soil with adequate moisture. By the autumn of 1980, the outer face of the hedgerow was barely visible as anything other than a line of thin sticks. Raymond Gale passed by in October of that year and told his wife the whole thing looked like Gerald had been trying to plant toothpicks. The summer of 1981 brought a wet June. Aldermore got 3.4 inches of rain in 17 days, well above the seasonal average. The lower fields took moderate water damage. Gerald's northwest corner stayed workable, not dry, but workable. He noted it in his farm diary on July 3, 1981, in 2 sentences. Said the berm appeared to have held the initial flow. Said the new planting was establishing well on the outer face, adding roughly 18 inches of additional depth to the hedge root structure. He planted another 40 yards of double hedge along the western boundary that autumn. Added another section in 1983. Raymond Gale came by in 1984 and looked at the hedgerow without commenting. He had taken some water damage in both 1981 and 1983, minor damage, the kind that makes a farmer think twice. He said nothing to Gerald, but he stopped mentioning Gerald at the market. By 1986, the outer hedge planting was 6 feet tall and beginning to knit. The hawthorn was the fastest. The blackthorn had taken longer to establish, but was now sending horizontal shoots into the dead wood packing. The elm brash was decomposing into a dense fibrous mat at the base that held its structure even under pressure. Gerald had added 2 more courses of dead wood in 1984, topping up what had settled. He had repaired 2 sections of berm where winter cattle had pushed through the outer planting. He had spent, in total, across 7 years, approximately 340 pounds on materials and an amount of labor he had never fully counted. His northwest corner had not had a significant water problem since 1980. The parish family flooded in the summer of 1986. Moderate event, 6 inches of rain over 5 days. Noel Parish lost 80 bales of standing hay in the South Meadow. Gerald lost nothing. He did not mention this to anyone. The August of 1988 came off a dry July, which is the worst kind of preparation for a major rain event. Dry July means compacted surface soil. Compacted surface soil means lower infiltration capacity. Lower infiltration capacity means more surface runoff. More surface runoff means the water moves faster, finds lower ground quicker, accumulates pressure against anything standing in its way. The hedgerows and ditch networks across Aldermore had been designed for a region that averages 23 inches of rainfall annually. The August 1988 event deposited 6.8 inches in 94 hours. Cullen Creek reached flood stage by Wednesday morning. Raymond Gale's lower paddock went under at 7 in the morning on Wednesday. He had 200 ewes grazing there. He spent 4 hours moving them to high ground. The fencing was gone by noon. His barley field, 31 acres, took standing water to a depth of 8 inches by Thursday. The grain was unharvested. He had been waiting on the weather to dry for combining. There was nothing left to combine. The Parish family lost their hay store on Friday. Noel Parish stood in his yard that afternoon with water running over his boots and looked south toward Gerald Fenn's property. Gerald's fields were visible from there. The northern boundary of Gerald's holding was elevated 3 feet above the valley floor. The hedgerow along that boundary was, by 1988, 20 feet wide at the base and 9 feet tall. The berm ran its full 140 yards in an unbroken line. The runoff from the north came down the slope in sheets, hit the berm, pooled behind the outer hedge face, moved laterally along the berm to the field corners where Gerald had dug collection channels in 1985, and entered his drainage network at a controlled rate. His northwest corner had 8 inches of standing water by Thursday morning. He lost that corner, 14 acres total. The other 34 stayed workable. His eastern fields, fully above the flood line, came through undamaged. His main barley crop, 22 acres on the elevated ground, had not been touched. Noel Parrish walked over on Saturday morning, when the water had begun to recede. He stood at Gerald's northern boundary and looked at the hedgerow for a long time. He did not say he had been wrong. He asked Gerald how it worked. Gerald explained it. The berm, the double planting, the dead wood at the base, the collection channels at the field corners. He explained it the way he explained most things, methodically, without emphasis. Noel went home and thought about it for 3 weeks. Raymond Gale did not visit. He spent August and September dealing with the damage. His barley crop was a total write-off. His fencing costs for the year ran to £620. He lost 14 ewes that had not been moved in time. The summer of 1988 cost him, by his own later reckoning, somewhere between £4,000 and £5,000 in combined losses and remediation work. Gerald Fenn's total loss for the same event was 14 acres of barley he had been watching with some concern anyway, and a section of outer hedge face that needed repairing after the flow pressure flattened 2 yards of the new planting. He repaired the hedge in October. Cost him a day and 8 new stakes. The district agricultural officer visited Aldermore in September of 1988. He was conducting a post-flood assessment for the ministry. He visited 6 properties in the valley. He spent 40 minutes at Gerald's farm. He walked the northern hedgerow. He measured the berm. He made notes on a clipboard and asked Gerald about the installation date, the plant species, the dead wood composition, the berm dimensions. He told Gerald it was the most effective low-cost water management hedge structure he had encountered in 12 years of fieldwork. Gerald offered him tea. He declined. He left his card on the kitchen table. The district officer published his assessment in a Somerset Farming Circular in November 1988. He described the hedgerow technique in specific terms: species selection, berm construction, deadwood infill methodology. He did not name Gerald. The technique had no name in his report. He called it, in measured official language, a compound boundary retention structure. He recommended it for properties on valley slopes with clay-dominant soils and a history of surface water accumulation. Raymond Gale read the circular. He recognized the description. He never discussed it with Gerald directly. The following spring, he began removing a section of aging hedgerow on his own northern boundary and rebuilding it on different principles. He bought hawthorn whips from the same Bridgewater nursery. He did not ask Gerald for advice, but he drove past Gerald's northern boundary 3 times over that spring and looked carefully each time. Gerald watched him from the farmyard once, said nothing. The technique Gale was attempting was close to what Gerald had built, but not identical. He did not include the deadwood infill. His berm was lower, 4 inches rather than 8. Spacing was wider. The hedge he built was functional. In a moderate rain event, it would help. In an event like August 1988, it was not clear it would hold. Gerald knew this, did not say so. Noel Parrish rebuilt his boundary in the winter of 1989, working from the description in the district officer's circular and from 2 afternoons of conversation with Gerald. He followed the method more closely. 8-inch berm, 14-inch plant spacing, 3 courses of deadwood infill. By 1993, his northern hedgerow looked close to what Gerald had built. His property flooded in the wet autumn of 1994. He lost 2 acres in the far east corner. His main field stayed workable. He told Gerald at the Shepton Mallet Market in November of 1994 that it had held. Gerald said he was glad. He had been using the technique for 15 years by then. Expanded it to the western boundary in stages. Added a section on the eastern face in 1991 after a small water event showed him a gap in the system. The farm's drainage performance, measured by days of workable conditions in wet years, had improved substantially since 1980. He had stopped losing the northwest corner to compaction. The clay subsoil there, over 18 years, had changed in structure. The roots from the hedge planting had penetrated 12 feet into it by estimate. The organic matter from the dead wood decomposition had been incorporated into the top 18 inches through earthworm action. His soil in that corner held less surface water and recovered faster than it had in 1969 when he bought the farm. He had made no significant drainage investment since the failed French drains of 1974. His total expenditure on hedgerow establishment between 1979 and 1993 was approximately £890, including all materials, stakes, replacement planting, and berm repair. Over the same period, Raymond Gale had spent in the region of £6,200 on conventional drainage, pipes, jetting, maintenance, none of which had prevented the 1988 flood loss. Gerald retired from full-time farming in 1997. He was 70 years old. He sold the working operation to a young man named Andrew Selby, who had been renting the arable acres for 2 seasons. Selby bought the whole property in March of that year for £184,000. He came to Gerald before completion to ask about the northern boundary. He had seen the hedgerow and wanted to understand it before he committed to the purchase. Gerald walked him along all 140 yards of it, showed him the berm, explained the plant structure, the dead wood at the base, the collection channels, told him it needed one major maintenance visit every 3 years, cutting back the outer face, adding dead wood to the base sections where settlement had occurred, checking the berm for any damage from cattle or machinery. Selby asked how long it would last. Gerald said it would outlast both of them if it was maintained. Selby maintained it. He added a further 80 yards of the same structure along the western boundary in 2001, following 2 wet autumns that had shown him where the farm's remaining vulnerability lay. He consulted Gerald by phone on the species mix for the second installation. Gerald recommended adding spindle and dogwood to the hawthorn and blackthorn combination for deeper rooting on the clay western face. Selby planted it as described. The wet winters of 2013 and 2014 were the worst flooding events in Somerset since records began. Aldermore Valley was affected substantially. The creek overtopped in multiple locations. Several farms in the lower valley took catastrophic damage. A property directly east of Gerald's old holding, not Raymond Gale's farm, Gale had sold and moved on in 2003, took standing water to 2 feet across its main yard. Selby's northern and western fields had surface pooling. His low northeast corner was underwater for 3 days. He lost some late-planted winter cover crop. His main fields and his eastern boundary stayed workable throughout. His neighbor to the north, who had purchased farmland in 2006 without knowing the valley's flooding history, lost an entire winter wheat crop that year. He came to Selby afterward, walked the hedgerow, took photographs, asked where the design had come from. Selby told him about Gerald Fenn. Gerald Fenn died in May of 2011. At 84. He had been living in a cottage in Shepton Mallet since 2003, when his wife passed, and the house in Aldermore became more than he wanted to manage alone. He had kept his farm notebook from the years on the property. There were 7 notebooks in total, dated from 1969 to 1997. The entry from July 3, 1981 about the hedgerow holding in the wet June is one of the shorter ones. 2 sentences, no particular emphasis, just the observation, recorded in the methodical way he recorded everything. His son found the notebooks when settling the estate, read them over 2 months, passed them to Selby, who had known Gerald and thought they should stay with the farm. Selby keeps them in the house. The northern hedgerow is now 36 years old at its oldest section. The hawthorn planted in April 1979 is 30 feet wide at the crown, 9 feet tall, and so fully knit that walking a straight line through it is not possible without tools. The dead wood infill at the base has decomposed almost entirely but left a root-dense, organically enriched soil layer 3 feet deep and 20 feet across that functions as its own infiltration zone. The berm has settled to 5 inches in most sections but holds its form. The collection channels at the field corners have needed clearing 3 times in 3 decades. In the flood winters of 2013 and 2014, the hedgerow held. It held in the wet autumn of 2019. It held in 2023 when Cullingham Creek jumped its banks again for the first time since 1988. Raymond Gale's old property, sold twice since he left it, has been through 3 different owners. The current occupant has installed underground land drainage at a cost of £22,000. He loses fields in wet winters. Gerald Fenn's northern boundary has not been modified in any fundamental way since 1983. Andrew Selby drove past it on a January morning in 2024, walking the field perimeter after 2 weeks of heavy rain. The hedgerow was dense, dark, and unbroken along its full 140-yard run. The field behind it had some surface pooling in the low corners. The main body of the field was carrying tractor weight. He stood there for a few minutes, Cold morning, ground soft, boots leaving marks in the turf. Then he walked back to the yard. The Hedgerow Gerald Fenn, built in 1979, is still there, still working, still holding water off fields it has no obligation to protect. Still just hawthorn, patience, and dead wood laid at the base the way a man in Wales had been doing it before 1860.